Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm William. I'm our senior manager of revenue platform engineering. So my teams manage or develop our actual advertising platforms, like the code that we're putting on the page to get ads on the page as quickly as possible. I've been at DDM for 2-ish years now, and before that, I spent 3 years at Amazon working on their publisher JavaScript tag for advertising. And before that, worked at an ad tech startup. And Nelson, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Nelson Brodyk. I'm a senior director for our ad product development engineering teams. So I sort of oversee the revenue platform engineering teams as well as our sponsored content teams as well, handling a lot of the revenue asks on that side.
Yeah. Before we get too far into the presentation, I'm going to apologize in advance. I did go a little bit overboard with the GIFs. I was having way too much fun with the Giphy Slack integration. So those will be scattered throughout. So for those of you that haven't been, head deep in advertising technology for the past 10 years, there's a lot of different terminology, and it's, that way with a lot of tech sectors. But the really 3 big important things you need to understand to really understand this presentation are, first, RTB, or real-time bidding. This is a mechanism for reaching out to advertisers and soliciting bids in real time. So we don't have to know ahead of time who's going to be displaying an ad on the page. We can in real time figure out who is willing to pay the most to display an ad on that page. To do this, we utilize Google Ad Manager. This is a service provided by Google, formerly known as DFP, or DoubleClick for Publishers. And it is basically a decisioning engine. You put a bunch of information into it, like bids from different partners. It solicits bids on its own. You also put in like your custom deals, direct deals with advertisers into it, and it will choose for each impression who should actually be winning that impression. And then the last one is Prebid. This is just an open source library that supports RTB. It's kind of publicly maintained, and a lot of different partners have plugins for Prebid. So if you integrate Prebid on your page, you get access to a lot of demand. But this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. These are a bunch of other companies that we work with for digital advertising. So it gets very complicated very fast, but we're going to try to keep it relatively simple for tonight. And speaking of simple, kind of the basic unit of advertising is called the slot. So anytime you see an ad on a page like this, it's a slot that's is the kind of mechanism for getting that ad onto the page. So a slot has a bunch of different information associated with it, but there's really 4 important pieces of information. The first is the slot name, and that is unique for each page view. So on this page, this is a SquareFlex 1 slot. There will be no other SquareFlex 1 slot on this page, or at least there shouldn't be. The second thing is the path, and that's this string right here. And this basically lets advertisers know where the slot is serving in the relation to the other content that we host. So this ad unit is serving on 3865, which is Dotdash Meredith's GAM ID. It's serving on Investopedia.com. It's a tier 1 slot, which means it's near the top of the page. It's on a structured content page, which is just one of our template types. And that structured content page happens to be about news. So as an advertiser, you can go in and select any level of this to target. So you could say, I want to advertise everywhere on Dotdash Meredith, or I only want to advertise on Investopedia. Or if you want to be as specific as possible, I only want to advertise on news articles that are structured content templates, high tiers, on Investopedia, in Dotdash Meredith. The third piece of information associated with every slot is the sizes that are available to be rendered into that slot. So for our SquareFlex 1 slot, we accept 300 pixels by 250 pixel slot ads, 300 by 600, 300 by 1050, and 160 by 600. So just varying heights and widths. And then the last piece of information is called targeting keys. And you can really think of targeting keys as query params for ads. This is just information that we're sending into GAM to help GAM decide which ads should be rendered. So this will include information like user IDs, which article specifically this ad is being rendered on, bids from our Prebid and Amazon partners, so information like that that GAM uses to then decide who should win that advertising impression. So once we have a slot, how we get an ad into that slot is kind of complicated. And so we're going to walk through it kind of piece by piece. So first we decide we're going to display this slot. We then create the slot in GAM's JavaScript library and then kick off our RTB flow. The RTB flow is the most complicated and time intense and resource intensive part of this whole process. So when we initiate an RTB request, we're actually reaching out to 2 distinct partners, at least at Dotdash Meredith, and in other cases there can be more. The first is through our Prebid adapters. So Prebid will make an individual HTTP request to each of the providers that you, or partners that you've connected with. So in this case, in this example, we have Index, AppNexus, and Magnite. So there will be 3 HTTP requests. Prebid will handle all of those. And when they come back or timeout, Prebid will process all that information and pass it back to us. The other flow that we use is through Amazon's transparent ad marketplace integration. Amazon is what's called a server-side integration. So we send one request to Amazon server. Amazon server then reaches out to the servers of all the different partners we're integrated with through Amazon, processes all those responses, picks the winning bid, and then returns that back to us. So at this stage, we now have all the bids from all of our different partners that are integrated both through Amazon or through Prebid. And we take that information and we pass it into GAM using those key values I talked about earlier. As soon as we have those key values set in GAM, we tell GAM, hey, we're ready to render this ad. And GAM fires off an HTTP request to their server, which then does all the decisioning logic, applying all the different layers of rules and things that we have set up there, and returns to us the creative HTML that we should render, which then reaches out for more assets. And then finally, we have a creative rendered on the page. So this is a very long, complicated flow. So it's really important to keep performance in mind through every step of this. Otherwise, it really quickly gets out of hand. And that kind of dovetails nicely with that mantra that we have at Dotdash Meredith. And you can tell it's our mantra because it was in the other presentation, and I didn't know it was in that presentation until I saw it 30 minutes ago. And that is, we want the freshest content. Ads actually have nothing to do with this, surprisingly enough. But we want it on the fastest sites. And this is where ads are very important, because the slowest part of all of our sites is our ads by definition, and with the fewest ads. And this is also really important for our team because we want to make sure every ad gets us as much money as possible so we can put as few of them on the page as possible, which makes the page faster because we're not loading as many ads. It's a whole big feedback cycle. So why care about ad speed in general, though, other than, we have that really cool mantra that says we should? There's a lot of intrinsic benefits to having fast ads. The biggest one is just impressions. The faster you get an ad on the page, the less time a user has to be on the page before they see an ad, which means people who are bouncing relatively quickly still get impressions. The second is viewability. Viewability is king in the advertising world. If your ads aren't in view like 70% of the time, which is defined as having 50% of the ad in the viewport for at least one continuous second, advertisers don't want to advertise there. And by loading the ads faster, that gives us more time for the ad to be in the user's viewport to be counted towards a viewable impression. The next is user engagement. Users don't like sites that are just popping in, little bits and pieces as they load. So if we can get the ads to load really quickly, then that gives a nice seamless experience for the user. And the users are more likely to interact with our ads because they're less intrusive and more performant. And then finally, SEO. Google likes fast sites, so we like fast sites. That's all you got to say. So how does this kind of work with optimizing for revenue? And the answer is optimizing for speed really is optimizing for revenue. When we do these optimizations for speed, we're increasing the number of impressions, we're increasing the viewability of those impressions, which directly drives revenue. There are sometimes trade-offs you have to make for speed versus revenue, such as how many partners do you integrate through Prebid? How many HTTP requests are you willing to sacrifice in order to get ads onto the page? And in those cases, we generally default to performance is king. We want to be more performant than all of the other sites so that our ads are worth more, even if that means we're sacrificing maybe 1 or 2 partners that we might otherwise integrate with. So we've kind of established we want to optimize for speed, but how do we do that at Dotdash Meredith? The biggest thing that we do that kind of sets us apart, in my opinion, is how long we delay our ad code. Most sites or most advertisers want you to put their ad code in the head. They want it to be render blocking. They want to load that JavaScript file as soon as possible, and they want code on the page. We don't agree with that philosophy at all. We don't even start loading our ad libraries until the content has loaded, our consent is evaluated in regions that require consent, such as Europe and certain US states, and then we start loading our ad libraries. This means that our ads are getting onto the page a little bit later than some of our competitors, but the way they work with the content works a little bit better. And this is what I kind of mean by that. When we load the ads after the content, we have less competition for resources. This is really important, especially in mobile environments where you're really limited on how many concurrent HTTP requests you can have going on. By delaying the ads, we now have all of those HTTP requests open instead of just a few of them, which means that all of our partners can be reached out to and respond more quickly. And by separating kind of those two concerns, content versus ads, both of them happen a little bit faster, which gives us an overall boost to our page speed. And then Of course, it's a better user experience, right? Users are coming to our sites for the content. They're not coming to our sites for the ads. We want to get the ads to the page as quickly as possible, but really we want to make sure that the users are staying on our site. And so by, kind of delaying that ad load and making sure content is first, we kind of can keep that engagement. Another thing that we kind of touched on in the last presentation in the Q&A section is performance testing. And this, it really is like an integral part of all the teams at Dotdash Meredith. On our ad team, before we can even merge a pull request, we're usually running performance tests. And that usually means an automated lighthouse job, as well as kind of the web page speed local test, especially if it's a bigger change. But once we launch, that's not the end of the story. We also like to do A/B tests whenever possible, especially with performance impacting changes. So we can see with 50% of the traffic running this change, are we helping or hurting performance? And is that help or hurt to performance worth the revenue that we're either sacrificing or gaining from that change? And in addition to the A/B testing, we're always kind of monitoring. We are using real user data, real user metric data. We're looking at page speed reports. We're looking at lighthouse scores. We're looking at our CLS score all the time. And 90% of the conversations I have with our vertical teams are, hey, William, our page speed or our first contentful paint went down, and we think it's because of this ad change. Well, how can we get that fixed? And so there's a lot of kind of give and take and communication of, hey, we're noticing this, let's try to work together to fix it. In addition to all the kind of just regular page speed and performance information that we're looking at, we've implemented a custom ad performance metrics system where we're collecting data on specifically how our ad libraries are performing, how slow they're going, and how much money they're getting us. I already kind of talked about the automated lighthouse testing that happens both in the pull request pipeline and against production sites. And then in addition to all of that, we're monitoring our revenue metrics, of course. We can't get away without monitoring those. We do need to actually make money. So things like impressions per session, revenue, all that's getting monitored. And so if any of these start to change, we can usually attribute it to a specific change we've made and then kind of optimize from there. When you're looking at all this information and specifically the ad specific performance metrics, you find some interesting things. And this was one of our biggest learnings of the past year. In GAM, there's a concept called MRA and SRA. MRA stands for multi-request architecture and SRA stands for single request architecture. And these are two different ways that you can request ads for the page. So in SRA, it's just what it sounds like. You get one request for all the ad slots that you're trying to load. So if I try to load ad 1, 2, and 3, it all happens on one HTTP request. So this is really performant, especially in low resource environments like mobile, where you don't have a lot of extra HTTP requests to be using. Combine all those onto one request, send it off, and you can get all of it back on one request. The disadvantage to this, or so we thought, is that you're now looking at the first ad not starting to render until the slowest ad has started to render. So if ad 3 wants to take 3 seconds to be decided in GAM, ad 1 is not going to start rendering until this entire request gets back. So that's why we had implemented MRA in a lot of our desktop environments, expecting that it meant that all of the requests are independent of each other. So if ad 2 decides that it's going to return super fast, it'll start rendering before ad 1 is even back to the page, and ad 3 can kind of take its time and do whatever. But this isn't what we actually saw in the data. What we saw in the data was that these requests are queued on GAM server. So if you make a request for ad 1, ad 2 doesn't even start processing in GAM server until ad 1 is back on the page. And then ad 3 is the same way for ad 2, which is terrible for performance and actually ends up resulting in a worse performance than if we would have just used SRA in the first place. So this is kind of the overview of how we think about performant ads and programmatic advertising at Dotdash Meredith. And now, Nelson, I'll hand it off to you to talk about heavy ad intervention.
Awesome. Thanks, William. That was really good. And while I get access here to the screen, just as William kind of walked through a lot of that, we do have a very big culture around performance and user experience here. And I think it's really important to kind of keep driving that message home. And everything that kind of William has shown and everything that the first presentation went through was really a lot around the things that we can control. Now, this is going to talk a little bit about the things we can't control and what we kind of do about that. So I'm sure people have gone to sites and end up seeing a message on the screen that might look like this, where an ad has been removed. So starting in 2020, Google rolled out with the Chromium engine this concept of heavy ad intervention. that effectively will block and remove any ads that are using up too many resources. Now, this is fantastic from our perspective and kind of really is in line with what we want to see and what we want to do. And we kind of really jumped at this opportunity because this was a way for us to sort of get a glimpse and a better purview into these offending ads and these other ads that we end up ultimately having to serve when they go through that bidding process. We cannot control a lot of what gets served. But as you'll see, what we've been able to do is find ways to kind of monitor that and then create a feedback loop with our partners and agencies to kind of work through that and make sure that we have a limited amount of these actually getting displayed. So first and foremost, this obviously with the Chromium engine, that's Chrome and Edge. There's other smaller browsers in terms of like total population share, but it covers a large portion of the internet traffic, especially with Safari and the way it works as well on mobile. Its goal is to really limit the amount of resources that the browser can actually use, or the page itself, and more specifically, the ad can use. And so we'll take a look at, so why do we care? Again, kind of just going back to these mantras, we want to have the fastest sites. If we have ads that are effectively using up a lot of bandwidth, using up a lot of CPU cycles, that's slowing down how quickly we can load our content. That can create a janky user experience if someone's trying to scroll. It just leaves a really bad impression on a user as well from user experience. When we're trying to grow brands, we want people coming back. We want them to find what they need, and we want them to keep kind of like a trustworthy and reliable brand. And if the site is loading fast and it's a smooth experience and we're staying out of their way, they'll be wanting to come back. And then the third big pillar here is revenue. If your ads are getting collapsed effectively on the screen, you're not getting an impression, which means you're not making money either. So these three things are very important. So motivating use cases, Google kind of outlined some very big cases on why they wanted to kind of roll this out, and I wanted to call this out because I think some of them are interesting. Like, namely, they even mention mining cryptocurrency. You can find people who create ads that literally try to use your CPU cycles to mine crypto. A lot of agencies or people creating these ads create poorly compressed images or have very large files or JavaScript files. The JavaScript itself can have bugs in it that continues to like eat up endless cycles. It's not really great. And obviously video is a big piece that's kind of becoming more prevalent. And so making sure that people are uploading files that are actually a reasonable size is very important. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about the criteria Google uses for heavy ad intervention as well. So if there's no user interaction on an ad and the main thread is used for more than 60 seconds in total, or the main thread is used for more than 15 seconds in any 30-second window, or more than 5 megabytes of network bandwidth are used, then you're going to get Google basically collapsing that ad, getting rid of it, and you're going to see that message that we saw on the first screen. And I think it's really interesting quote here. While 0.3% of ads exceeded this threshold, they account for 27% of network data used by ads and 28% of all ad CPU usage. So this is kind of a interesting topic because I think as an industry, publishers, you want to have that great experience. For Google, they want to still be able to create, a great ad experience because that's where they're making a lot of their money. And then obviously, if they're using up a lot of like network time and CPU time across everything, that's just not ideal, right? So you're talking about battery drain and just performance experience. So it's definitely skewed, and it's good that this kind of exists today. So I want to kind of go into a little bit about what happens when an ad is removed. So when we have an ad put on a page, they render in an iframe. There are third-party ads that we don't control and that we don't have the ability to say, how it's built. We have our partners and our bidders bidding. The winning ad just gets sent back. We get JavaScript, makes calls, we get HTML, the ad renders onto the page. We can't really control that. The good news is that Google kind of generates a report, and it's triggered at the root ad iframe. And it uses the reporting API that already exists and is the intervention reporting type. And this is going to be really valuable for the way we kind of solve this. So if it comes in from a third-party source, then it's up to that third party to handle the report. So you're kind of thinking, what could we possibly do to know about it? So we get this on a site. The third party will get told. We don't get told. So what we ended up doing around this is we got a little bit creative, no pun intended, and we looked at GAM's creative wrappers. So a creative wrapper is basically an iframe that sits around all the ad slots, all the other iframes on our pages. So every single ad that we render will have this creative wrapper loaded to it. The beauty of it is that the creative wrappers allow you to have code snippets. And it can let us get additional information around the winning ad. So we can get the campaign ID, the creative ID, everything like that. What's really nice about this is we were able to kind of then use these creative wrappers to find a way to basically observe the events happening within them and then reporting it up to the page. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So in creative wrapper, we basically have an observer that is listening for these events that are occurring, these interventions. Once we actually get that, we post that information up to the parent page. Then we use GTM to basically load a small listener on the page itself that is listening for these events. Once it gets that event, it identifies a report type. If it's the one we care about, we then take that information and we send it to Google Analytics. So now we actually have this data in our data lake, and we have many different views that we can look at this. I'm only going to show a little bit today because I don't want to show too much like any proprietary information that we have around any of our campaigns or anything like that, but it does give us a lot of ability to look into it. We can look and say that this specific direct ad campaign is failing heavy ad intervention 25% of the time. So we're able to go back to the partner and say, hey, look, this is really not performing well. I'll show you one little clip here from a piece of one of our boards. So this was just the snapshot of all the warnings basically across coming out of the creative wrapper for a single site for a single month from a few months ago. I wanted to show this because I wanted to really call out the CPU time that gets used. I think most people would expect that these interventions are caused by a network and that people are loading just too large of assets or trying to do too much as ads are now getting a little more dynamic and animated and interactive. And you have billboards and you have kind of the right rail skyscraper kind of units that can kind of go down the side of the page. But the reality is CPU is actually the biggest culprit. And I think this is an important thing for anyone working with ads to realize is like that amount of time that it takes to kind of process the ad or whatever's happening. A lot of agencies and other places don't necessarily put in the time or the effort. They say, oh, well, the image is only like 5K, we're good to go. But the reality is they might have JavaScript that's not working correctly, or they might be loading frameworks to try and load their ad units, which kind of can cause delay and contention. So I think this is a really interesting one that I think when we started doing this was a surprise for us too, but this is fairly consistent for us where CPU is generally the bigger culprit. And just wanted to wrap up and say how you can use this information. So with this kind of information, if you're able to capture this and you're able to work with your ad ops teams or work with any media partners where you're having direct deals, you can go to them directly and say, hey, this campaign, these ad units are not performing well 25% of the time or whatever percent of the time. They're not loading, you're not getting your impressions, you're not actually getting what you're paying for in essence too, and it's a bad user experience for us. So we try to work with them and try and get them to kind of work on that. And just like I said, they're generally aware of network usage, but not CPU. So this is kind of a place where education can kind of help and kind of comes into play as well. And I think this is important to use as ensuring you have a healthy site. If you get too many of these, it's a bad user experience. And interestingly enough, we've kind of had a little bit over the last little while where we're actually investigating an uptick in heavy ads being triggered on some of our sites and figuring out what's happening there. So it's been a great tool to be able to kind of create a monitoring and a feedback loop. But I also find that this is one of those things where, as an industry, as the publishers, as ad servers, as agencies, everybody should have a vested interest in making sure that their ads are as performant as quick as possible, because in the end it leads to more revenue. And with that, just for William's part and my part, any questions? I know that's a lot.
I'll help just moderate the questions. Thank you, William and Nelson, for a great presentation. Any questions? Sergey.
Yeah, I actually have a question. So you mentioned the industry working together as an industry. By the way, can you hear me? Is that right? Yeah. Okay, perfect. As an industry, we should come together and combat it together, because I've been in the publishing industry before. It's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. Amazing work, by the way. Is there any organization or some kind of other formal way for us to come together? Do you know of any?
Like, would there be like a developer organization or like a publisher organization to kind of provide collective bargaining almost, or
well, there's IAB, right? IAB would always put out like their general guidelines on how ads, what size they should be, and all that. I think there's a lot of general guidelines.
Yeah. The issue with the IAB is nobody follows the IAB standards for anything.
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying they're there.
They put them out.
No one listens to it, but they're there. But I would say that leads into a question though that I've had. Do you guys actually reject ads, right? You'll reject a lot of ads for if they violate something or if they're too heavy or.
Yeah, so we have a couple of different mechanisms for that. So heavy ad intervention is one of them. Really, the majority of it is we have like content blocks on ads. So like certain types of contents we will not allow on our sites. And if you get caught serving those contents, then we kind of go back to the advertiser that allowed that ad to serve and block them from the site as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that, right? Like if you're serving these things, and I'm just picking a random number, 25% is obviously going to be high, right? But if you're serving a direct deal where you're guaranteeing a number of impressions, for example, and their ad fails 25% of the time, that's not just lost revenue on that ad, but you could have bid on that slot those 25% too. So it's kind of compounding in terms of the loss there, in terms of a revenue hit. So I think it's really just, it's important that people do look at this, and we do go back to the agencies and the clients, and we do say, like, there's been times where it's been very much like, if you can't get this fixed, we're not going to serve this in this slot because it's too valuable of a slot.
Thanks, William. Nelson, would you mind turning off your screen share so we can see you in a larger? Oh, there you are. You were about both like 5 inches tall, and about 20 feet. So now
it's okay. I look better at 5 inches tall, so I'm good.
But yeah, Sergey, thank you, Jeff, for that question. But yeah, that was a really interesting question about maybe that's a post-show discussion, but I know you both won't be on the call. I mean, did you have any thoughts in general about kind of how the publishing industry can work to improve kind of the ad industry, maybe?
Yeah, and it's always going to be tricky with ads in my experience, right? Because publishers don't want to give away the secret sauce. And like even just doing this presentation, right, we have to go through several layers of, okay, what information are we allowed to share? What information do we have to be kind of like more vague about? What information are we not even allowed to mention? And so that makes it more difficult to kind of collaborate on ads like you can on PageSpeed. Like we can't do a super technical presentation like the one before this on ads, just because like our executives would be like, whoa, what are you doing? Why are you telling them all of our secrets? So I mean, it's always going to be harder, but I think events like this that encourage performance for the site as a whole kind of naturally bleed over into advertising as well. At least I would hope so. And so honestly, an event like this is a really good first step in saying, hey, like these are the problems we're having with advertising and performance. These are how kind of we're trying to approach those problems. Do you all have better ideas or different ideas, or are you all willing to, work with us and do similar things to help kind of push the industry in the right direction? The IAB is a great mechanism. Like I said, a lot of people just don't listen to the IAB, but more and more people enforcing those standards would be super helpful too. So, I mean, there's a few different paths. It's always going to be tricky with ads, though. Money makes everything more difficult.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think one of the big places that you see change quicker, I guess, is when Google does something. They have such a presence in the market, right? If them rolling out heavy ad intervention almost forces places to kind of get better at it, because they have such a lion's share of the market, right? That they can kind of help drive those things too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a response to Sergey also, like, coming from the publishers background a little bit. Publishers have two sides, right? One are the engineers, developers who are working on the side, putting their blood and sweat into making sure it works fast. And then there is the ad department. Ad departments have to make money, right? So there is the pressure there.
They pay for engineers.
Yes, exactly. So it's not that easy to even create something where you actually would have a way to enforce, which is why AAB, which tells you that you have to put Z-index of 10 million on your ads. Yeah, that's where they are. But anyways, we ended up putting a secret flag that's voting ads to prevent to get to a similar state that I think William was talking about, where you delay ads before content is loaded as well. And also the question. The pre-bid library has existed for a couple of years, and even back, I believe in 2018, 2019, there was a movement towards server-side bidding. And you guys have outlined precisely why client-side bidding is detrimental to the performance, which is why I'm curious, like, in 5, 6 years, 7 years since the pre-bid library became pretty much predominant in the industry, why are we still doing bidding from the client side? Can we push all the ad servers to accept server-side bidding and streamline that?
I would love to.
Cookies.
Yes.
Really, that's why partners want to be client side, right? Because they can get access to their third-party cookies 100% of the time instead of doing like cookie matching. I think that as soon as third-party cookies go away, like, the push to have everybody client side is going to go away as well. Everybody's going to be okay with being server side. And so that's why we have client side bidders still, is because we have certain partners that are just like super high value for us. And so if we can still make them relatively performant, it's better for us to have them client side versus through a server side integration.
And I think, just to add to that, like the whole cookie problem is interesting, because when Google finally deprecates it, they've talked about it a few times now, and it sounds like that pushes on again. When it actually happens, the cookie, or the concept behind what the cookie is being used for right now, isn't really going away. It's just being pushed somewhere else, right? So it's going to open up these other tools that allow you to do intent targeting or do unique ID tracking of users, but it's going to be done on the server and not on the browser side. So that's where I think you start seeing the move towards a server side approach, where if people are doing server side, like true server side, not the client side to a server side approaches, I think you'll see that take off, as William said, once cookies are done.
Yeah, the trick being, I think Permutive's rolling out a lot with session storage. So there are some very weird workarounds that companies are working towards. But yeah, I think everyone's kind of got a different rollout strategy. But the hope, yeah, would certainly be that we could improve performance. Other questions on ads? Yeah.
A little off topic then. You have a great shirt, no cookies, no problem. Are ad blockers a problem?
For us, ish, but not really. So when Dotdash purchased Meredith actually had like an ad blocker tracking solution, and they found that they were having such low rates of ad blockers in use on our sites, at least, that it wasn't really worth it to port it over to the Dotdash tech stack. So we actually don't track it right now, but historically we haven't had an issue with them. knock on wood, but we so far.
It's interesting that you brought this up because a lot of publishers over the past few years have been moving to Admiral, which you go to pretty much any news site today. The first thing you see is a pop up, if you have Adblocker, obviously, and you see a pop up, support us, or here's how to disable your Adblocker. Sometimes there's also a hidden line there, like, okay, continue without supporting, which some hide. But how's that different? So functionally, right? If you guys are saying that you're not seeing a lot of people using ad blockers, and yet everybody's putting Admiral on their site, are they using different way of detecting ad blockers, or why would one method be more popular versus the other?
I think there's a couple of potential reasons, and honestly, I don't know the real answer. My best guess is that we have just a different user base than a lot of those sites. Just our users, for some reason, may not have as many ad blockers enabled. Either they're less technologically advanced, so they don't know how to install an ad blocker, or they just have decided not to for some reason. And kind of addressing the banner specifically, we kind of live by the philosophy that if we treat our users with respect, they'll treat us with respect. So if we put up an ad block banner that says, hey, like, you've got this ad blocker on, like, that creates a poor user experience and they're more likely to leave our site. So it's better for us in the long term if more people are willing to spend more time on our site, because then that also helps us with SEO and driving more new users to the site in and of itself. So I honestly, I don't know why we don't have a big problem with ad blocker, but we don't so far, and our strategy seems to be working for some reason.
I love it. Treat your users with respect and make websites fast. This is perfect.
I have kind of an add-on to that, where sometimes I have trouble, as an engineer, I'm kind of lower on the totem pole, and pushing back on things like that and saying, like, offering a better user experience, higher quality ads keeps people on our site, makes them have a better experience, makes them want to come back. But it's very hard to kind of prove those things. So, a lot of the time, like, new features get held up or don't get built because of, ad related concerns. So I guess my question is, like, how can we as engineers or product people or designers or whoever, like, start advocating for these things, for better user experiences? Because sometimes it's hard, when you're like, when you're dealing with like an ad team or higher up executives who only want to see numbers. Like, what do you have, like, ways that you kind of help bring these concerns up or voice them so that we can advocate for better products for our users?
That is a great question. And William, I know you want to jump in on this one too. I just want to quickly say, like, that I think it starts with your leadership and the culture at the company, right? Somebody mentioned Ben Cochran earlier. All of us here on the engineering side, it's much of a what I always kind of coined as like horse trading. It's like, no, you can't keep adding pre-bid adapters and different partners. Like, there's a cap that we have that we allow. We can, through A/B testing and performance testing, prove that those hits happen, and we can objectively show that this is what's happening, right? And so companies can sometimes get caught up chasing, well, we have this deal with this partner and this with this deal, but that doesn't now always necessarily lead to a better yield. And I think the focus on yield over just impressions or over rate, and looking at like that actual holistic system outcome is important. And you have to want buy-in from the company. And so Dotdash and Dotdash Meredith have always been very driven on data. And I'm sure Russ can speak to this with his performance side, right? And we have a performance team even that we fund, right? But we just have that culture. And there's a lot of aspects that I can probably go into, but I just would probably say at the high level, we have a culture of a proper user experience and figuring out revenue from that. And that engineering here just gets a large say in conversation and in topics. So I can't say enough about the culture that we have here to kind of have that give and take.
I think what Nelson's trying to say is, if you want to do this, just join Dotdash Meredith, and that'll be good. And like Nelson said, it's a lot about culture, but even with the culture at DDM, like, it's still a battle, right? Like, tech has a very large say here, but we still have to say no quite a bit. We kind of joke that a lot of deals get made on tennis courts over lobster meals. And then we have to kind of push back on that as a tech team because, our sales team's thinking, oh, they just see the dollar signs and they don't see the bigger impact to our site. And kind of to add on to what Nelson said, we're lucky here in that our traffic is relatively dependent on our page speed. So if we decrease page speed, we see a really rapid response in terms of how much traffic we're losing. So it's a lot easier for us to make the case like, hey, if you add this new adapter, yeah, you might incrementally increase revenue like 5%, but you're also going to decrease traffic by like 20%. So it's a net loss overall. And so like having that, it's a hard case to make. I will agree with you, but there are ways to find that data and to use that data to say, hey, long term, this is the right play. And that it's still a conversation and a battle sometimes here. Like most recently with refreshing ads, I hate refreshing ads in most cases. There are cases where refreshing the ad is the right thing to do, but a lot of the time it's just a play for impressions, right? Like let's drive up the volume as much as possible, but that ends up devaluing all the rest of your inventory. And like we have that conversation on almost like a weekly or bi-weekly basis of like, hey, can we refresh these ads or can we refresh the ads faster? And we kind of have to keep going back and saying, no, like looking at the data, that is going to hurt us long term. And we know that from like historically, we've refreshed ads, killed our inventory value, and then had to rebuild that slowly by stopping refreshing ads because we were getting into that death spiral of like, oh, rates are declining, so we can refresh faster, which makes rates decline, which means we refresh faster, which means rates decline. And so it's always going to be a battle. Like you're always going to be fighting salespeople, you're always going to be fighting business people that see dollars and cents. But at the end of the day, it's just about finding the right data and finding a culture that will empower you to use that data and say, hey, no, like long term, this is what's best.
Great, and I'll add, just two things to that. Oh, sorry, what'd you say, William?
I said it also we're hiring.
Yeah, I didn't have the email for that, so if you want to screen share the page, that would be great. That when you go into those conversations, how you approach it does make quite a difference. If you go in kind of that it's a fight, but don't go in that way. So you're going at, because whenever we had to kind of do some interventions or something, you go in knowing that everyone wants the best and don't assume that they have to be at odds with each other or communicate that, because people are really sometimes willing to give a little leeway. Like say if it's like, oh, okay, here we have this issue. Well, this piece, we could ask the ad partner to improve this, because it's like some part of video pre-roll and we know that vendor and, and we're going to ask them. And then, okay, well, we can improve this placeholder to make sure that the CLS issue is better, or that it goes down rather. And so, those kind of conversations really help because, and then build trust over time, because then when you also have the numbers for performance, when you say, okay, we're losing X amount of time on our page load and that costs this, that's very compelling.
Can I add something?
Yeah,
I have a lot of experience with this, being on the both sides, the consulting and as a customer facing, like battling what was mentioned, trying to make a culture, and it's extremely hard. And what you said was right, to like go in there and say that I'm not here to stop you from doing something. I'm here to like make you do it the right way. That's kind of like what we had to do. It was like a constant battle of getting everybody on the same side. It's super hard to do, and it takes a long time to build that. You guys have it here. You're lucky. Like it's not the case everywhere, but some ideas that I had were thrown out the window because one of my ideas was not related to ads, but the script comes on a site like in SLA. I want to know the timing allow origin. I want to know how long that script's going to take. And I want a content security policy to block that script unless they meet the SLA. Like that's,
very creative.
Yeah, that didn't fly though.
Yeah.
It was still
William, Nelson, thank you so much for joining us remotely, and thank you all for coming. And I'll hand you back to Sergey.